I never thought I'd be the kind of man who doubted his own sanity. But that's exactly where I found myself last winter, standing in the hallway of my own home, staring at the closed door of our guest room like it was a crime scene. My name is John, I'm 38, and until recently I believed my marriage to my wife, Natalie, was the safest part of my life. We had been together for 12 years, we bought a house together, we planned vacations, birthdays, and someday kids. We fought sometimes, sure, but never in ways that felt dangerous. Never in ways that warned me that I was losing my grip on reality one tiny manipulated detail at a time. It all started when Natalie told me her distant cousin, Kyle, needed a place to stay. She said he was going through a rough patch, lost his job, lost his girlfriend, didn't have anywhere else to go. I'd never heard of a cousin named Kyle before, but Natalie insisted they'd grown up together. She even showed me one blurry childhood photo of her with a group of kids at a family barbecue, claiming one of them was him. I didn't question her. Why would I? A marriage is supposed to be built on trust. Kyle arrived with one duffel bag and a smile that was too polite, too rehearsed. I remember shaking his hand and thinking he looked a little old to be crashing with relatives, but again, not my business. It was supposed to be temporary. A couple of weeks tops, but weeks turned into months, and with each month came a shift in Natalie's subtle, slow, strategic. At first she acted stressed, always tired, always irritated. She told me I was imagining it. Then she started accusing me of forgetting small things at first. She said I left the stove on. She said I moved her keys. She claimed I forgot conversations we absolutely never had. I'd push back, and she would stare at me so intensely, with such controlled disappointment, that I'd end up doubting myself. Maybe I had mixed something up. I was working long hours. Maybe I was distracted. She kept saying, "You've been so forgetful lately. I'm worried about you." And she said it so gently, like she genuinely cared, like she wasn't rewriting the truth under my nose. Kyle mostly stayed in his room, which somehow made things worse. There was something eerie about a full-grown man living quietly behind a closed door in my house. I heard movement sometimes late at night, footsteps, soft laughter, a low voice I couldn't place. When I asked Natalie about it, she sighed like I was a burden to her. She said I was overthinking because work was getting to me. She said Kyle was asleep by those hours anyway. She said I needed rest. "You're getting paranoid," she whispered once while resting her hand on mine, voice trembling like she was the one suffering. "Please don't scare me like that." And I felt guilty. Guilty for asking a basic question in my own home. That was the start of something I didn't yet have a word for, being conditioned to accept doubt as logic. One night, around 2 a.m., I walked past the guest room on my way to the kitchen. The door was cracked open an inch, and I swear I heard whispering inside. A man's voice and a woman's voice. Natalie's voice. My chest tightened. My first instinct was to push the door open, but something stopped me. A fear I can't explain. A fear that maybe I wasn't stable enough to handle what I'd find. The next morning, I asked Natalie carefully, gently, if she'd been in Kyle's room the night before. She laughed. She didn't look confused or offended. She laughed. A short, sharp laugh like I'd told the dumbest joke imaginable. Then she said she hadn't left our bedroom at all, and if I heard something, it was probably the heating system making noise again. Except our heating system had never once made noise like quiet whispering. But Natalie looked at me like she was waiting for me to realize how ridiculous I sounded, and again, doubt washed over me. She added, "John, you've been losing sleep. You're starting to scare me. This isn't like you." She said it so lovingly that I felt ashamed for even questioning her. Over the next few weeks, she escalated her tactics. She'd insist I misplaced things, even though I'm meticulous. She'd say I'd agreed to certain plans I definitely hadn't agreed to. She once even told me I'd shouted at her during a conversation I didn't remember having at all. I had no reason to believe I'd ever shouted at her, but she described it in such detail that the image formed in my mind a version of me I didn't recognize but couldn't fully dismiss. Kyle, meanwhile, hardly interacted with me. He didn't join us for meals. He didn't make small talk. He seemed to only come out when I wasn't home. And every time I brought up concerns, no matter how small, Natalie shut them down instantly. She said I needed therapy. She said stress was affecting my perception. She said I was projecting my insecurities. And I believed her. God, I believed her so deeply that I genuinely wondered if something was wrong with me. But all of that culminated the night I found something I wasn't supposed to find, something that snapped the spell just long enough for me to breathe. It happened when Natalie borrowed my laptop for work and forgot to log out of her email. I didn't mean to snoop. I really didn't. But a new message popped up from someone named K. The subject line was short, but it was enough to freeze my blood. Tonight. The moment I saw the subject line, my vision tunneled and my heartbeat thudded so loudly I could barely hear the house around me. For a second I just stared at the screen, telling myself it could be anything. Maybe a work contact, maybe a reminder, maybe something completely harmless. But the sick weight forming in my stomach told me I already knew the truth even before I clicked. When the email opened and I saw the short message, "He's finally breaking. Be ready." The room tilted. My first instinct was to believe I misread it, that the words didn't mean what they clearly did, that Natalie couldn't possibly be talking about me, couldn't possibly be planning anything with Kyle behind my back. But the email sat there like a slap, unmoving, undeniable. I felt something hot and electric shoot through me, like the final crack forming in a wall someone had been pounding on for months. I didn't confront her that night. Something inside me, the same thing she had slowly been dealing with her gaslighting, suddenly sharpened. I knew if I asked her about the email, she would twist it, spin it, convince me that I'd misunderstood again, that I was seeing patterns that weren't there. She had said that phrase before, often, and each time she said it, I felt a little more unsure of myself. But this time, with evidence right in front of me, I knew I needed more than instinct. I needed proof so solid she couldn't break it apart with a single manipulative sentence. So when I heard the shower running upstairs, I quietly forwarded the email to my own address, then deleted the original and cleared the history. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the mouse. For weeks I'd felt like a ghost in my own home, tiptoeing around Natalie's shifting moods, feeling the walls breathe with secrets I couldn't name. And suddenly the fog lifted just enough for me to see the outline of something much darker than cheating. They weren't just hiding a relationship, they were monitoring me, studying me, waiting for me to crack. And the worst part was, I still didn't know why. That night, I barely slept. Natalie cuddled against me like nothing was wrong, her breathing slow and steady while my mind raced. Every time she shifted, I flinched, wondering how many of her little touches, her sighs, her concerned glances had been rehearsed. When I finally drifted off, I woke up just before sunrise to the sound of a door closing gently down the hall, the guest room door. I held my breath. Soft footsteps moved across the floor, followed by a whisper so quiet I couldn't make out the words. Then, silence. When Natalie climbed back into bed a minute later, pretending she'd just gone to use the bathroom, something inside me finally severed. I didn't call her out. I didn't react. I just lay there pretending to sleep, letting her think I was still trapped under the spell she had woven so carefully. Later that day, while she was out running errands, I checked the guest room. Kyle's duffel bag was still there, but something was different this time. There was a faint smell in the room that hadn't been there before. Something warm and familiar, like the scent of Natalie's shampoo. I searched a little deeper and found a small silver earring under the edge of the bed. It wasn't hers. I'd never seen it before. That discovery should have made things clearer, but it didn't. It made them more confusing. If Natalie was cheating with Kyle, why was there another woman's earring in his room? Was he seeing someone else? Was Natalie covering for him? Was someone else staying with him at night? The idea of a third person involved twisted the situation into something even stranger, something I couldn't fully understand. And then, just when I thought the confusion had hit its peak, I heard the one thing that shattered whatever remained of my denial, a voice recording. It happened completely by accident. I was taking out the trash when I saw a small device on the ground beside one of the bags. It looked like a cheap keychain recorder, the kind you could buy online for $10. I assumed it belonged to Kyle because he'd been moving things around the garage earlier. I picked it up, curious, and pressed play. Static. A shuffle. And then Natalie's voice whispering, "He's almost there. Just keep doing what we talked about." My pulse spiked. A second voice responded, a woman's voice I didn't recognize. "Are you sure he won't figure it out?" Natalie whispered back, "He already thinks he's losing his memory. He's questioning everything. That's the point." My hands trembled uncontrollably. There was no mistaking any of it. It was her. It was real. And it wasn't just her and Kyle, there was someone else working with them. Someone who had been in my house. Someone who had been close enough to speak in whispers in the dark. The recording ended abruptly, and I stood frozen in the driveway for what felt like hours. They weren't just gaslighting me for an affair, they were manipulating me for a purpose I still didn't know. I replayed that recording 10 times before my brain caught up with what my ears had already learned. This wasn't emotional cheating. This wasn't lying. This wasn't normal betrayal. This was coordinated, planned, long-term, and I was being pushed deliberately towards some kind of breaking point. But why? The question rattled in my mind like loose metal, scraping and screaming for answers. They had been watching me unravel. They had been encouraging me to lose myself. And someone else was involved. I had to know who. I had to know the motive. I had to figure out what they were hoping to gain by tearing down my sanity piece by piece. That night, I hid the recorder in my own toolbox behind the shelves in the garage, knowing I'd need it later as proof. Then I went inside, acting normal, smiling like a man who wasn't being hunted in his own home. And when Natalie kissed my cheek before bed, I didn't flinch. I just told myself, hold it together. Not yet. You need more. And I'd get it because the next thing that happened would send everything spiraling into a direction I never could have imagined. I woke up the next morning determined to find whatever piece of the puzzle I was still missing, the part that connected all of their actions into one clear motive. Because there had to be something bigger behind the months of manipulation and whispered plans. No one goes to that much trouble just to cheat. No one plays psychological chess with someone they supposedly love unless they're after something worth destroying a person for. And the more I thought about it, the more one possibility kept surfacing: money. But Natalie and I never fought about money. We both worked, we shared accounts, we had decent savings but nothing extravagant. Then another thought crept in, a darker one: my life insurance policy. I remembered the day we signed it, years ago, how she insisted we get one with a high payout just in case something ever happened. I brushed it off then, thinking she was being cautious. But now, with everything I'd uncovered, the idea took root like a parasite in my brain, refusing to let go. What if this wasn't about breaking me mentally? What if it was about setting up the perfect excuse for something to happen to me? Something that would be dismissed as stress, or sleep deprivation, or a breakdown. The thought chilled me to the bone. I needed answers, fast, and I realized I'd never once checked Kyle's background. I only had Natalie's word for who he was, and that was worth less than nothing now. While she showered, I used the time to search our home office for the personal information he wrote down when he registered temporarily at our address. Natalie insisted we handle it properly for legal reasons, but she kept the papers locked away. I broke into the drawer with a screwdriver and found a thin folder with his name on it. But when I opened it, a wave of nausea hit me because the name wasn't Kyle at all. It wasn't even close. The ID photocopy inside belonged to a man named Lucas Warren, a man with a record, a man with a history of fraud and identity scams. I stared at the picture, trying to reconcile it with the polite, quiet cousin who'd been living under my roof for months, and suddenly everything made sense in the worst possible way. He wasn't her cousin. He was a plant, a pawn, a partner. Someone she trusted enough to bring into our home under a fake name for a plan that required secrecy and control. Someone dangerous enough to play along. I snapped a photo of everything. I didn't have time to process more because Natalie stepped out of the shower and called my name. I hurriedly locked the drawer, shoved the screwdriver into my pocket, and acted like I was just looking for a tax document. She smiled at me so sweetly that it made my stomach turn. The rest of the day I acted normal, but inside I was mapping out every move. They wanted me disoriented. They wanted me doubting myself. They wanted me pliable. So I decided to play the role perfectly. If they wanted a confused, unraveling husband, that was exactly what I'd be until the moment I struck back. That night, I pretended to fall asleep early. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside our bedroom door, soft, slow, then to voices: Natalie's and the mysterious woman from the recording whispering urgently. "He's spiraling," the woman said. "Good," Natalie whispered back. "We need him unstable by Friday." Friday. They had a deadline. Something was planned. And if I didn't figure out what it was, I might not live to see Saturday. I waited until their voices faded, then quietly slipped out of bed and followed the faint glow coming from downstairs. I stayed hidden behind the banister as I saw them: Natalie, Lucas, and a woman I'd never seen before. Tall, dark hair, sharp eyes. She carried a folder stuffed with documents. They spoke in hushed tones I couldn't fully make out, but I heard enough to know Friday was the culmination of everything they were planning. Something about the evaluation appointment, something about his behavior record, and something about the signatures already being ready. My blood ran cold. Evaluation, record, signatures. That's when it hit me: they were prepping something legal, something official, something where my mental state mattered, something where if I appeared unstable, I could lose everything. maybe even be institutionalized. And I remembered that over the last few months, Natalie had checked in on my mental state with coworkers, neighbors, even my own sister. Little comments about my forgetfulness or stress or strange behavior. At the time I thought she was just venting, but now I realized she was establishing a pattern, a story, a narrative. One where I was the unreliable one, the forgetful one, the unstable one. One where she was the patient, worried wife desperately trying to get me help. And worst of all, I remembered something else last week, without warning. She had convinced me to sign a stack of bank update forms she said were related to refinancing. I didn't read them. I trusted her, but now I feared what my signature had actually been used for. I backed away quietly, heart pounding so hard I thought it might echo through the house. When I returned to bed, I lay awake until sunrise, knowing that I had only a few days before their plan, whatever it was, reached its final stage. I needed leverage. Real leverage. Evidence that couldn't be explained away. The recorder wasn't enough. The ID wasn't enough. I needed physical proof of their meetings, their plans, their intent. And I needed someone outside the house to know everything in case something happened to me. The next morning, Natalie told me she had scheduled a surprise appointment for me on Friday with a specialist because she was worried about my mental health. She said it with tears in her eyes. Real-looking tears. And if I didn't know what I knew, I might have believed her. I nodded slowly and said I understood. Her smile was soft and grateful, the smile of a woman who thought she was winning. But the entire time, I was thinking about what I needed to do before Friday. I had 2 days to expose all of them. 2 days to survive living in a house with people plotting against me. 2 days before whatever they planned became irreversible. And I had no idea that what I'd discover next would be the most disturbing part of all, because when I finally tracked down the woman from the recording and learned who she really was, everything spiraled into a truth far more twisted than anything I had imagined. The following morning, I made my first move, careful not to raise suspicion, as Natalie hummed in the kitchen like she wasn't slowly tightening a noose around my life. I left the house under the excuse of getting coffee, but the moment I drove off, I turned toward the address I'd found on a piece of mail in Lucas's folder, an apartment listed under the name of the mysterious woman from the recording. I didn't know her real identity yet, but the envelope had been addressed to our boss, and the neat handwriting stuck in my mind. When I reached the apartment, I didn't approach the door. Instead, I waited in my car, watching, pretending to scroll my phone while adrenaline pulsed through every vein. After about 30 minutes, she stepped out. Same sharp eyes, same cold posture, wearing a dark coat and carrying a clipboard. She looked like someone who lived in control, someone who made a living off of other people's vulnerability. And when she walked toward a car with the logo of a private psychiatric consulting service across the door, everything snapped into clarity so fast it made me dizzy. She wasn't just involved. She was a professional. This wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a coordinated effort to paint me as mentally unwell on paper, with a licensed consultant ready to sign off on whatever narrative they were crafting. The puzzle pieces slammed together violently, the fake concerns Natalie had shared, the staged conversations, the missing objects, the whispered plans. They were building a case, a file, a documented trail of symptoms. My signature from last week suddenly burned in my memory. Those weren't banking forms. They were authorizations, releases, papers granting her access to my medical information or giving permission for evaluation. Maybe even power of attorney transfers if they had been bold enough. They were preparing to legally incapacitate me, and on Friday, in less than 24 hours, they planned to complete it. I ducked down instinctively as she passed by my car. She didn't notice me. I watched her drive off, and once she turned the corner, I stepped out of my vehicle, hands shaking so violently I could barely insert the key into the lobby door. But luck was finally on my side. As someone exited the building, I caught the door and slipped inside. I reached her apartment, heart pounding against my ribs. I didn't have a key, obviously, but sometimes people forget the basics. I tried the handle. Unlocked, I slipped inside, shutting the door softly behind me, listening for any sign of movement. Silence. The place was immaculate, cold, nearly sterile. Papers lay neatly arranged on the small dining table, and my stomach flipped when I recognized the top sheet, my name printed across it in bold letters. Psychological behavior decline log, subject, John M. Carter. The words hit me like a physical blow. I picked up the packet, flipping through pages of lies. Episodes I never had. Conversations that never happened. Incidents Natalie fabricated and our boss dutifully documented. There were even timestamps of aggressive tone, memory lapses, and paranoia escalation. It was a blueprint of a man losing his mind, a man they could easily commit. And each page bore Natalie's signature alongside the consultant's. But the final page was the one that nearly made me collapse. Recommendation: full psychiatric evaluation with potential involuntary hold if patient resists treatment. Involuntary hold. They wanted me locked away, medicated, silenced, out of the way. My breath shook as I scanned the line just below that recommendation. Prepared for emergency execution on Friday at 3 p.m. Emergency execution. The phrasing wasn't literal, they meant the execution of the plan. But the word execution still felt horribly fitting, because that's exactly what it was. The execution of my freedom, my autonomy, my entire life. I snapped photos of every page, each image clearer than the last, evidence too strong for even Natalie to spin. I was about to leave when I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. On the counter sat an envelope addressed to the Carter residence, at Natalie Carter, and beneath it in smaller letters, guardianship confirmation packet. Guardianship. That was their endgame. Not just committing me, not just taking my voice. Natalie wanted legal guardianship. Over me, over my assets, over everything I owned, over the house, over the accounts, over decisions, over my entire existence. And according to the documents, our boss had already approved the preliminary stage. My hands shook so violently that I dropped the envelope, and it scattered papers across the floor. Among them was something even worse, another form, unsigned but prepared, labeled Petition for Emergency Protective Custody with sections ready to be filled out after the Friday evaluation. They expected me to resist. They wanted that resistance. They needed me to appear unstable, volatile, paranoid. They had engineered every moment to push me into a reaction that would confirm their lies. And if I panicked, if I shouted, if I even tried to argue my innocence, the consultant would document it as proof. If I refused the evaluation, involuntary hold, if I complied, they'd still claim I lacked insight into my condition. If I ran, they'd mark me as dangerous and delusional. Every path had been designed to trap me. Every move I made played into their hands unless I moved first. Just as I finished photographing the last page, I heard footsteps approaching the door, slow, confident, getting closer. My pulse nearly exploded in my throat. I scanned the room for any escape, any hiding space, and I knew if our boss caught me here, everything would be over. I couldn't risk being found. Not here, not now. Not with her holding all the legal power she needed to twist this moment into an episode. The doorknob rattled. I ducked behind the coat closet, barely squeezing into the narrow space. The door clicked open. She walked inside. And in that moment, as I held my breath and prayed she wouldn't hear my pounding heart, something happened, something that twisted this already horrifying situation into something far worse than I had imagined. Because the voice that answered her from the hallway wasn't Lucas, and it wasn't Natalie. It was my sister. John thought he'd felt every possible version of betrayal already, but standing outside the courthouse holding the folder of evidence that had taken him months to gather, he realized betrayal could keep mutating long after the relationship that birthed it had died. Natalie walked out flanked by her attorney, her eyes red but her posture strangely upright, almost proud, as if she'd survived something noble rather than caused every ounce of the chaos that had unfolded. She glanced at him only once, not with guilt or regret, but with the detached curiosity someone might have when spotting a stranger who looks vaguely familiar. That look told him everything he needed to know. Whatever version of him she had loved or used no longer existed for her. But the case wasn't over. Not yet. Her lover Mark had been arrested the week prior after. Police found his fingerprints on the safe in the guest room and matched footage showing him sneaking in through the side gate on nights he wasn't living with them. The stolen cash, the missing jewelry that had mysteriously vanished months earlier, items Natalie had chalked up to John's forgetting or misplacing, had been discovered in a storage unit Mark had rented under a fake name. The police had found enough to charge him with multiple counts of theft and with attempting to access their joint accounts through a clone debit card discovered in his backpack. Natalie insisted she had no knowledge of any of it, and to John's shock, investigators couldn't yet tie her directly to the financial theft. Her manipulation, her gaslighting, the affair, none of that was legally punishable. Morally damning, yes. Legally binding, no. But John wasn't walking away empty-handed. The judge granted him full control of the house, citing Natalie's breach of trust and her involvement in enabling a situation that had created emotional duress and unsafe domestic conditions. She would get her share of smaller financial assets, but nothing from the home, nothing from his inheritance from his parents, and nothing further from him emotionally or legally. The consequences she feared most, the unraveling of her public image, hit her the hardest. Her friends had quietly distanced themselves. Her family offered tepid support but couldn't deny the truth. The evidence was too thorough, too damning. And the night the investigative report aired on local news, covering the story of the guest room intruder, anonymized but recognizable to anyone who knew them, she disappeared from social media entirely. But John's relief didn't come from her suffering. It came from the quiet that finally settled around his life once the noise of her lies evaporated. The house felt different now that it was his alone, not in the possessive sense, but in the unburdened one. He began opening windows again, letting in sunlight without worrying about who might be seeing through it. He slept with the bedroom door open, something he hadn't done in months, without understanding why he'd stopped. And sometimes, at night, he would stand in the hallway outside the guest room and feel a ghost of the dread that had lived there for so long, the instinct that something was wrong, that someone was lying to him, that the weight on his chest wasn't imagined but carefully placed there. That room, once a hiding place for the man who had helped dismantle his marriage, became empty again. Then one evening, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, he found a notebook he'd used years earlier when he and Natalie first moved in. Inside it were lists, ideas for the future, things he wanted to build, places he wanted to visit, projects he wanted to learn. Reading those lists felt like meeting a version of himself he'd forgotten existed, someone who believed life was stable and that people were mostly good. He didn't feel angry at that version of himself. He felt sorry for him, and then proud, because that man had survived something brutal and manipulative and still remained recognizable on the other side. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, John attended Mark's sentencing hearing. Mark refused to look at him when they brought him in, shackled and gaunt, a shell of the arrogant man who had once lounged freely in John's home, pretending to be nothing more than a temporary house guest. The judge gave him for years, not nearly enough, but enough to ensure he would no longer be a threat. When John stepped outside afterward, the air felt cleaner somehow. He walked to his truck, sat in the driver's seat, and didn't start the engine for almost 10 minutes. Instead, he breathed. Slow, deep, real. Recovery wasn't a moment. It wasn't a verdict or a signature or a prison sentence. It was the gradual quieting of all the questions that had once kept him awake at night. He rebuilt his routines, reconnected with people he had unintentionally drifted from. He began therapy, not to understand why Natalie had done what she did, because he knew now that nothing would ever make her choices logical, but to understand how he could make sure her shadow never dictated the rest of his life. And slowly, unmistakably, the shadow faded. One afternoon, months later, he walked past the guest room door and realized something startling. He no longer felt anything at all. No fear, no anger, no memories trying to claw their way back. The room was just a room. He had his life back. He had himself back, and that was the one thing neither Natalie nor her lover had ever expected he would reclaim. They had taken his trust, his peace, his sense of reality, but not him, never him.